traditional territories of the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Squamish First Nations, who have lived on and continue to call these lands home. Osiem. Conversations Live is a long-form public affairs dialogue series that seeks to advance our understanding of the issues of our times. We also strive to draw attention to organizations that make a difference in our province. Tonight, I want to introduce you to Share Family and Community Services, a social service organization based in Port Coquitlam that provides assistance to more than 57,000 people each year. Joining us tonight from Share Family and Community Services are CEO Claire McLean and Osman Naam. Osman, sorry. I encourage you to check out this incredible organization, and if you can find ways to possibly help to support them, that would be greatly appreciated. Joining us from Victoria tonight is Vancouver Sun legislative reporter Alec Lazenby. Now, just before we get started, for anyone who wishes to pose a question, please go to slido.com and enter the passcode Conversations Live and send in your question, whether you're live online or in the room. Sean, our Slido master, will be receiving your questions and bringing them forward to us. While we can't get to all of them, your questions do inform me about topics and questions that we will be asking this evening. Now, to further set the stage, here's Mario Canseco of Research Co., who has been conducting polls for our Leaders series. Arav, can you run the first of 3 videos that we'll be playing this week from Mario?
More than half of BC residents think climate change is a fact and is mostly caused by emissions from vehicles and industrial facilities, while 1 in 4 believe it is a fact, but mostly caused by natural changes. Only 13% think climate change is a theory that has not yet been proven. More than 2 in 5 BC residents think we all need to do much more to deal with climate change, while just over 3 in 10 would be willing to do a bit more. Fewer than 1 in 5 BC residents feel we do not need to do anything to deal with climate change, a view shared by 19% of BC residents aged 35 to 54 and 23% of BC Liberal voters in the 2020 election. More than half of BC residents feel it would be in our best interest to scrap the BC carbon tax if the Conservative Party of Canada forms the federal government and ultimately abolishes the federal directive. Just over a third of BC residents would keep BC's carbon tax if Pierre Poilievre becomes Canada's Prime Minister, while 13% are undecided. While almost half of BC residents feel that there are some good things about healthcare and some changes are needed, just over 3 in 10 believe that the system has so much wrong with it that we need to completely rebuild it. Just 1 in 6 BC residents think healthcare works well and only minor changes are required to make it work better. When asked to pinpoint the biggest setback with BC's healthcare system, more than 2 in 5 BC residents say it is a shortage of doctors and nurses, a number that rises to 55% among those aged 55 and over, and to 56% in southern British Columbia. About 1 in 4 BC residents think the key issue that needs attention is long waiting times, a view shared by 34% of those aged 18 to 34. About 2 in 5 BC residents say they are open to considering paying out of their own pocket and going to another country to have quicker access to medical services that currently have long waiting times. The number of residents who would be open to cover their own expenses in a 2-tier system reaches 39% among BC NDP voters in 2020, 43% among BC Green voters, and 55% among BC Liberal voters. For Conversations Live, I'm Mario Canseco from Research Co. More than half of...
Now, just one more video before we get started. It's a short little video that I put together that provides a little bit of background on Sonia and her path through politics to the leadership of the Green Party of BC. RF, can you please play that short video? And then we're going to get to questions.
Another beautiful day at the legislature. Out here, I'm one of the good guys. But there aren't that many good guys left.
Sonia Furstenau attended the University of Victoria, where she completed her BA and MA in history, along with her Bachelor of Education degree. It's interesting to note that while at university, she was a single mom. So to support herself and her family, she ran a bookkeeping business. After completing her university education, Sonia worked as a high school teacher in Victoria and then in Shawnigan Lake. She also continued to be engaged in a wide variety of non-profit organizations, such as Citizens Climate Lobby and Okio Credit, which is an international microcredit agency. After moving to Shawnigan Lake, she learned the provincial government had issued a permit to allow for the development of a 5 million ton contaminated soil remediation facility that was close to the source of Shawnigan Lake's drinking water. Sonia went to work for the Residents Association to protest and appeal the permit, and was later elected as director of the Cowichan Valley Regional District. Through persistent opposition to the landfill, in January of 2017, the provincial government suspended the permit to the landfill. That same year, Sonia was elected as the Green Party MLA for Cowichan Valley. That spring, she helped negotiate the power-sharing agreement between the BC Greens and NDP that led to a coalition government for 3 years. In 2020, Sonia was elected leader of the BC Green Party, as overlapping crises such as a lack of affordable housing, a collapsing healthcare system, and an extreme weather event were taking a devastating toll on British Columbia. Sonia is passionate about concurrent issues such as accessible healthcare, affordable housing, environment, and climate change.
Since becoming leader, we have broken fundraising records as the BC Greens every single year since I became leader.
Oh, wow, okay.
Yeah, so we're appealing to a lot more people who are more willing to donate.
In June of this year, she and Adam Olson, the province's other Green Party MLA, released a video on YouTube titled, "Is BC Just One Big Company Town?" In it, she calls the province a resource colony, and in particular, turns her attention on LNG.
The BC Greens, we're the only ones willing to stand up to the LNG companies.
Sonia, welcome.
Oh, thank you so much.
A little history about you and your interesting video that you put together this year. I want to start by asking you, let's fast forward to the evening of October the 19th and the votes have been counted. What do you envision will be your role in the governance of British Columbia when the votes have finally been tallied?
You know, I've been talking a lot about a vision for the future. That's what our platform and our campaign is about, is a vision for the future of British Columbia. But I've also been talking about a vision for election night. And I'm very excited by this vision. On election night, we have an announcement that a handful of independents have been elected in BC. Independents who were former MLAs and who decided to run on principle and to continue to work to represent their communities the way they have been in the legislature. A bigger handful of BC Greens are elected on election night. Jeremy Valeriot, who's in the room right now, in West Van Sea to Sky, who was 60 votes shy of getting elected in 2020. He actually got elected on election night, and there are still people in West Van Sea to Sky who think he's the MLA. That's one of the larger handful of Greens. We have Arzina Hamir. I was just in Courtney Comox. She's building a movement. It's an extraordinary campaign that she's building up there. We have Chris Hergesheimer in the Sunshine Coast. We have Nicole Charlwood, Sonia Furstenau, that's me, Victoria Beacon Hill, Rob Botterill in Saanich, Camille Curry, who's been fighting for healthcare reform, got an award from Doctors of BC. So we are looking at somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to a dozen seats. And so on election night, we've got that handful of independents. We've got a bigger handful of Greens. And nobody on election night has all of the power. And I see Carol Taylor, and she and I remember election night in 2017 when that was the outcome. And I think that that is the best outcome for British Columbia. I think that's the most representative legislature that we could have. It would be the most representative legislature in BC's history. And it would be a legislature that would be forced to find ways to work together and to focus on the job that we're elected to do. Represent the people of our ridings, of our constituencies, but also work together to solve the problems that we face in British Columbia. And what I found 7 years as an MLA, 3 years before that in locally elected office, and really in my whole life, is the way that we solve problems is actually get a diversity of voices and perspectives and opinions around the table and listen and take into account all of those different perspectives. And from that, we can achieve so much more than what our political system typically delivers to us, which is, I'm going to disagree with you because you said this and I'm in the other party. And I'm going to point fingers at you because you did this when you were in power and now I'm in power. It is exhausting in the legislature. All of the finger pointing, all of the time that's spent on, you did this and you did that and you're so terrible and we're so great. We need serious people because we are in serious times. We have a healthcare system that's not delivering for people. We have a growing loss of trust in public institutions, in government, in business. We have communities that need to be pulled together based on the things that unite us, not divide us. And we have a bright and wonderful future that we have to start building for this province. This needs to be the best place to live on earth, but it's not right now. But we need people who are elected who take that responsibility seriously, and the best outcome is an outcome where all of that responsibility is shared in that legislature.
So let's assume that your predictions are accurate, and there are a handful.
Mario.
Mario. In 2017, the Green Party aligned itself with the NDP. Do you envision a repeat of that? And I'm going to add sort of a secondary question to you. Do you think that that was the right thing to do in 2017?
I look back at 2017 and I think there were a lot of good things that came out of that confidence and supply agreement. So it wasn't a coalition government. It was us agreeing to support the government on confidence votes and supply votes, so budget votes, in exchange for an agreement that we made public that is still available online. You can still find it, the confidence and supply agreement, that put out what the government would accomplish on what timeline. Banning big money was number one. So the end of anybody being able to write a $100,000 check to a political party, that came to an end. And other forms of electoral reform that actually, when we saw the municipal election outcomes, it was a whole shift in who got to be elected, because we also made reforms to municipal election financing. So we saw a whole bunch more women and younger people and more diversity come in the next local election. We did changes to environmental assessment. I actually ran into somebody from the Environmental Assessment Office who said that as a person that is working in that office now, those changes were really good. They really made a difference. We saw changes to professional reliance, which is what brought me into politics, and the failures of that system. And so I look at that and I say, okay, there were a lot of good things that were accomplished, and the public got to come along. They got to watch, and they got to hold government accountable. There was a timeline. There was clarity about what was going to be delivered. And I look back at that time, and there was a lot of, well, Mario can confirm this, but a lot of satisfaction and a lot of trust in government at that time. So those are good outcomes. But of course I look at and I say, well, how could we have done better for BC? What lessons do I take away from that and say, what can we, how can we approach this scenario again, if this is where we're at, and ensure that we're even more aligned to the outcomes for British Columbians. And much of what drove the negotiations in 2017 was what was in the BC Green platform. And we take our platforms very seriously. I can't wait for it to be released in the first week of October. I call it the Book of Hope and Joy. It's a vision for the province that we could have. And so what I am going to be, if we're in that scenario, which I hope we are, it's really about finding the alignment on how, as elected representatives, how, as a government, are we going to effectively and efficiently start delivering the things that people should expect from government? A healthcare system that works, a healthcare system that's there when you need it, an absolutely thriving public education system. There is no investment more important than investing in our children, investing in education, ensuring that we are keeping and attracting the smartest people to BC to come and study here, to come and set up business here, to come and be part of the innovators and the entrepreneurs and the dreamers who are going to help us shape that better future. We need a government that's focused on how do we respond appropriately to climate change. And it's not a burden to say we have to respond in a rational and appropriate way to climate change, if in fact it could be the greatest boon to our economy to go all in on a clean economy in BC. We have everything we need in this province to become a true economic powerhouse in terms of the capacity for clean energy that we have in every corner of this province, the capacity for us to be the leaders on innovation when it comes to clean energy, when it comes to capturing and storing and moving clean energy, when it comes to creating regional energy security in every part of this province so that when climate events happen, and they will, people can feel more secure knowing we've actually done the work to be able to withstand these impacts. There's so much for us to do, and what I want is to be part of a legislature that is focused so intently on solving these very solvable problems.
But would you enter into a confidence and supply
You're
agreement?
so funny. Yeah. So this is a question, and I'm starting to get this question asked a lot. I think there's an array of options and possibilities, and it would be very strange for me to say right now, this is what I would do, because I don't know what the outcomes are going to be. But I do know that there are all of these these options and possibilities, and when you look at countries around the world that almost always deliver minority governments, in proportional representation countries, most of Europe, most of European democracies are proportional representation. And so it's a standard thing after an election to look around and assess who's there, who's in the room, who's at the table, and how do we start working together? How do we create the conditions that are going to best serve the people of BC? And that conversation can happen in a minority outcome, and it doesn't happen in a majority outcome. What happens in a majority outcome is the winners say, well, now we've got all the power, we're heading over to the Premier's office, and it's concentrated in there, we're going to do whatever we want for the next 4 years. Suck it up, buttercup, right? Like, it is not a good thing for democracy and for outcomes for people when we allow too much concentration of power. Let's embrace the possibility that we have in BC right now to deliver a truly representative legislature.
Great answer. Now I see Alec online here in Victoria. He's chomping at the bit. He's got a question for you. Alec, over to you.
Hi, Sonia. I just wanted to ask, you're facing a tough re-election battle in Victoria Beacon Hill. You've obviously moved down there from Cowichan Valley. You're moving with your husband. Your sons both live down here. But just wondering, how do you compare this to 2020, when the NDP went all out in trying to get you booted out of Cowichan Valley, and how are you preparing for another tough race here this year?
Thanks, Alec, for that really fun memory of 2020. Really love that. So a couple of things. Number one, there are 3 people who have ever been, well, 4 if you count Jeremy between election night and when the final ballots come in, who have ever been elected as Greens in British Columbia. It is a lot of work to get elected as a Green. It doesn't happen by accident. And my campaign in 2017 in Cowichan was months and months of hard work of knocking on thousands and thousands of doors. In 2020, of course, we didn't have that opportunity. It was a snap election. I think that the opportunity that British Columbians had to get to know me a bit better in forums just like this, and to see and hear from me directly as opposed to the story about Greens that people might have in their minds, I think that that helped. In this election, very much the same thing. I'm probably the only leader of a party right now that is knocking on doors regularly in Victoria Beacon Hill. And what I'm finding is an enormous amount of support and excitement about the kind of representation that I'm offering. It's proven. I'm a proven hardworking MLA for my community, for my constituents, and I'm making the offer to the people of Victoria Beacon Hill that not only can you have a very strong voice and advocate in the BC legislature, but you can be entertained by my bon mot for the next 4 years as I try to also make you laugh. Because for me, the work has to be a combination of purpose and joy. And when we have both of those things, I know that we're on track. So I am working very hard in Victoria Beacon Hill and very hard as the provincial leader of the party. And I'm driven by that vision of what is possible. And I hope that I can inspire enough people in British Columbia to share with me that vision, that hopeful vision that we have for British Columbia.
So a lot of times people may not know much about the Green Party. They go, Green, okay, the environment, that's your issue, got it. But I want to go to Sean because there's a question that has come in here that is not about the environment, and it goes to show, I'd like to have him ask this to you because I am always impressed by the depth of information and knowledge that you have on a broad range of issues. Sean?
Thank you, Stuart. The question from Marilyn is, recently your party has come under fire for criticism of the short-term rental restrictions. Can you elaborate on your position on short-term rentals?
Yeah, I'm really glad that this question has been asked. So the legislation that was passed on short-term rentals was really to ensure that short-term rentals weren't impacting the capacity for people to afford to live in BC. And I think that that's an important issue that we have to look at. And I hope we get more questions on housing. We just released a piece of our housing platform today that includes vacancy control and historic investment in non-market housing, which is what we need in BC. I was approached by people in Victoria, by hopefully future constituents of mine in Victoria, who wanted to tell me about the impacts that this legislation had on a particular group of people, not the Airbnb companies, not people that have invested in multiple properties, but people who had one grandfathered investment as a short-term rental and who were impacted by that legislation in a way that was very surprising to them. They weren't consulted, they didn't know that it was coming, it came out of the blue, and it didn't give them time to prepare or to understand the impacts of this legislation. And I think a really important job of a representative, of myself as a current, but aspiring, hopeful, future representative for these constituents, is to hear from them and to understand how legislation has impacted them, and to understand that the process that this legislation was brought in wasn't inclusive of consulting people that were going to be directly impacted by it. And so I often say about government, how you do things really matters. And if you're bringing in legislation that has an impact on a group, and in this group, the rights that they had to operate these units, like one unit each, were grandfathered rights. And so when they purchased the properties, they purchased it expecting some certainty for their investment. And for a lot of them, this has been quite distressing. And so I think that my purpose in meeting with them and listening to them was to get that information, to get that insight. And the commitment I made to them was, on the other side of the election, is to look at whether this legislation, and particularly this one clause that took away those grandfathered rights, was done in a way that was fair and was done in a way that builds trust and builds a sense that government is operating in an open and transparent way. And I would argue in this case they weren't. And so the job of a representative is not to only meet with the people that you might be fully in agreement with. It's actually to hear from everybody. And especially when it comes to how is legislation impacting people, it's your job as their representative in the legislature to know that.
So earlier this year, Sonia, we held a panel that we called The Environment and Politics, in essence. Yeah. And I asked the question, so if the political heat starts to get a little too hot, what's your commitment to the environment? We were assured that we're never going to waver from our commitment to the environment. I believe that coming from you. What's your reaction to what you've been witnessing, not just last week, but we can take a look nationally. Pierre Poilievre is calling for this to be a carbon tax election. We know where Mr. Rustad stands. And then there was the surprise response to a question from the Premier. What do you make of what's going on? Yeah.
I'm Carol Taylor, and as you mentioned earlier, it was Carol who was the architect of the carbon tax in 2008, who brought that in to BC. And BC was, at the time, I was part of Citizens Climate Lobby, and we would go off to Washington, D.C. and lobby Congress and Senate members and say, we're from British Columbia. We have a price on carbon. We have a fee and dividend system already operating. And look how it's already benefiting the BC economy. It's sent a signal to the world that we are an economy that is focused on building a clean energy future, that we are an economy that's focused on innovation, that we're an economy that's going to attract clean tech companies. We have 7 of the top 100 clean tech companies right here in BC, largely because of the commitment that the government made in 2008 to responding in a rational and appropriate, and I would argue fiscally responsible way to the pollution and the cost of carbon pollution to our society and our economy. There's nothing more expensive than ignoring climate change. In 2021, the atmospheric river, the wildfires, and the heat dome combined cost our economy, it's estimated between $11 and $17 billion. I don't know how you can be a serious politician in 2024 and suggest that you don't have to take climate change seriously. The fact that people in Merritt are still trying to rebuild. People in Lytton have never gotten to go home. People in Jasper have lost a third of their town. People in the lower mainland, where we need dikes to be rebuilt so that we don't have another flooding event like we did in the atmospheric river, are wondering whether those investments are going to come. And so we need to look at the cost of carbon pollution, and we need to have a system that is clear and transparent and fair, and that achieves what a price on carbon is meant to achieve, which is a signal to the market to say you need to big business and to industry and to small businesses and to individuals, you need to work on decarbonizing your activities. And that signal worked. That signal worked in BC. We did see a reduction in emissions. The challenge that we've had is once you start tinkering with the system and you make it more complicated and less easy to understand, and suddenly the biggest polluters are paying less in carbon tax than individuals are, and it starts to feel a lot less fair, and we're not seeing the transparency of how the rebate is coming back, and we're not seeing the clarity of the policy, it becomes easy for it to be politicized and weaponized by political actors who want to use it to convince you that this one thing is the thing that's causing you the most problems, and if we just get rid of that, we'll be able to solve problems. The carbon tax is understood to have contributed to about 0.33% of inflation when it comes to groceries. Fossil fuels are directly related to 1/3 of the inflation that we've been seeing in Canada. 1/3 of inflation connected to fossil fuels. If we want to have less inflation, if we want to have a more secure and stable and predictable economy, which I think we do, then we need to de-link our economy as much as we can from fossil fuels, from a global commodity that has shocks in it like we saw after the war in Ukraine started. And we need to go all in on building this powerhouse economy that we're capable of building here. And we need to stop having political conversations that are 3 words long, and we start having political conversations that are paragraphs and even essays sometimes. But the reality is, if we don't take the conditions that we're in right now in 2024, if we don't take those seriously and we have unserious policy responses to that reality, we are not going to get out of these crises and these challenges that we face. This current government budgeted $400 million for wildfire this year. We put out a press release and we said, that's nonsensical. There's no way you're only going to spend $400 million on wildfire. We got the budget update a couple weeks ago. We spent $1.1 billion on wildfire. The government itself is saying, well, we have a bigger deficit because of the impacts from the wildfire. That's in one breath. And then in the next breath, the same government says, we're going to take the price off of carbon pollution. Make this make sense. What we have to do is ensure that the revenues from that price on carbon are going to benefit the people and the communities of British Columbia. And people have to be able to see that and understand it and feel it and recognize that government is taking responsible action by putting a price on the pollution that is driving inflation, that is driving our costs going up, and it is using it responsibly to help us move to a place where we do have that more secure, more resilient, more predictable, and more certain future that we all want.
Alec, I'd like to come back to you. You've got another question for Sonia.
Yes. So how do we make that make sense in the sense of you talk about wanting voters to really realize the challenges that we are facing with climate change, but in an election where we are talking about affordability and people are more worried about putting food on their table, keeping a roof over their head. I know you just came out with your housing plan today, but how do you make an avenue and space for a climate discussion in an election where that might not be top of voters' minds?
This is a great question, and it's so important. Alec interviews me all the time, and he knows that I answer in paragraphs all the time. And so here we go. The fact that we are not talking about the record-breaking profits that have been extracted in Canada over the last several years since COVID, the fact that we aren't talking about the fact that when the oil and gas sector is taking home tens of billions of profits, and when we are seeing the grocery industry take home record profits, and when we see big business taking in record profits, and mostly those going to shareholder dividends instead of being reinvested back into the economy, which is the best thing to do with profits in order to ensure that we're getting the economic activity that we all need to see. The fact that we're not talking about those things, but we're instead focused on a tax that is returned back to people as the driver of what is being presented as the problem in the economy right now is astonishing to me. Like, we really have to have a conversation about government's role in ensuring that we not only have a floor that people don't fall beneath. It used to be called standard of living. We used to have a social safety net that we made sure that people were not falling through that social safety net and landing in tents on the side of our streets in communities all over this province. But we also have to have the conversation about the ceiling. And we've stopped having conversations about the ceiling and about how much profit is a reasonable amount of profit to be taken before government steps in, like they did in the UK, and say, we're going to put a windfall profit tax in place now, thank you very much, because we think you've had enough. And we're going to take that windfall profit tax and we're going to return it to the social programs that protect people who are struggling the very most with inflation and lack of affordability. Government needs to play a protective role. Government needs to play a role of saying that in between the forces of capitalism, which are just fine, but that between those forces and the people, there needs to be a responsible body that says, yes, you welcome and please operate your business here, but here are the conditions. Because our job is to make sure that people have affordable housing, reliable health care, excellent education, and infrastructure that can withstand the increasing impacts of climate change. And so it's a Wizard of Oz moment. Don't look behind the curtain. Why are we not having a conversation about the fact that in the last 4 years, the billionaires have gone from a collective wealth in the tens of billion to the last time I checked, it was 12.4 trillion. And then today when I checked, their collective wealth is now 14.2 billion. We have a ceiling problem, and we have to solve that problem.
So the interesting thing about that money, though, is that it has the ability to go anywhere. And if we're operating under one set of principles saying here's the ceiling, and we're not creating an attractive enough investment climate to support the jobs that we need, that money can go somewhere else. How do we compete against that, I believe, very real issue? Because without those larger businesses, the economy of BC is not as strong as it could be. It's not middle-sized and especially not small business that is the backbone of the economy. It's those big companies. And we need to be able to create an environment that says, you're welcome here. So how do we balance things out and still leave the welcome mat at the door?
Well, this is the conversation we were having downstairs. But I would argue that we do need to say to small and medium-sized businesses, you're welcome here.
But we don't necessarily do that.
No. So, number one, let's start doing that. Let's start ensuring that the entrepreneurs and the innovators and again, the brightest minds are recognizing that this is a place that they want to be. One of the problems we have right now is that people can't afford to live here, can't rely on the systems that they need, and so they're leaving. So you can have all the business you want. If there's nobody here to actually work in those businesses, we have a problem, right? There needs to be a recognition of the role that government plays in striking the balance between the conditions that make it appealing for businesses to invest and to set up shop here. Ideally, a lot of those businesses should be BC-based and homegrown businesses. We've made it very hard for them to thrive and succeed, and we should be doing a much better job of that. But we have to let go of some of the old stories that we have about BC's economy. We should not be striving to be a primary economy. We should be striving to be a secondary and a tertiary economy. We should be striving to export not raw resources, but export manufactured and value-added good, and then export what comes with a knowledge economy. When we invest in truly the upper levels of education and innovation that we should be doing, and we're exporting innovation and ideas and solutions. We're creating the Pacific Northwest Institute for Renewable Energy, and in the location up in Terrace or Prince Rupert where there is extraordinary geothermal potential, we're not only tapping that clean energy, we're creating the technology and the innovation to store and to move that energy, and we're exporting that to the rest of the world. We're showing that we have the leadership and the capacity to be a global leader, not a global laggard that is propping up industries that requires subsidies just to exist. We spent $5.4 billion to convince LNG Canada to come in and set up shop here. Imagine $5.4 billion to convince clean energy and innovation and high tech to come and set up shop here. What a difference that would make to move us off of a boom and bust economy that has left communities, as we just saw in Prince George with Canfor leaving, a number of mills again shutting down. These boom and bust cycles are not good for a long-term sustainable economy. We need long-term thinking when it comes to policy, and the role that government plays in that is sending clear signals, being predictable, creating certainty, but most importantly, tending to the things that government is meant to tend to: healthcare, education, infrastructure, affordable housing, transit. Make sure that people here can thrive so that businesses can hire people who are well and thriving and want to be here. There's a lot of work to be done to get BC to the place that it should and can be, but we will not get there by believing stories that no longer make sense. We will not get there by pretending that climate change isn't real. And we will not get there by wishing that we were back in the days of yore when we could export raw resources and that was enough to hold up our economy. It's not.
So let's go to a topic that's top of mind for mayors throughout the province. They brought it to the agenda today at the UBCM. Sean, can you give us the question about what your strategy is towards the drug crisis?
I can. What strategies will you implement to address the root causes of drug addiction and prevent more people from falling into substance abuse?
I'm really grateful for this question. I think this is a conversation we have to be having as a province, and that question isn't being asked enough. So when we look at what creates substance use and addiction, we have to start with what evidence tells us. And we know that a lack of connection and a lack of belonging and a sense of isolation can contribute to substance use and misuse and eventually to addiction. We know that when young people don't have enough trusted adults in their life, that they're more susceptible to using substances. And so where do we start with this crisis? And this crisis is brutal. Can we please remember that 6 people die every day in BC from a poison drug supply? 6 people, most of them in their homes, most of them men, most of them not necessarily suffering from substance use disorder or addiction. We have to understand that this crisis is cutting across all socioeconomic lines, it's cutting across every community, and we have lost that important realization that 6 people in this province die every day from a poison drug supply. And I'm so distressed that we've gotten used to that. We have to invest in what evidence tells us solves this. We have to invest in making sure that the social determinants of health are guiding our decisions and our investments. We have to invest in those thriving schools. where kids are going to school and they don't feel like they're spending their days in buildings that tell them that adults don't really care about them that much because the buildings are run down, there aren't enough teachers, there are not enough education assistants, there certainly aren't enough school counselors or psychologists. We have to invest there. We have to make sure that our kids have programs. Like at the same time as we are hearing all of this rhetoric around the drug poisoning crisis, the funding to Big Brothers and Sisters gets cut in my community. Like, how are we doing that? The funding to counseling programs that were affordable to people so they could access mental health care, that funding gets cut. We've been calling for psychologists to be included under MSP, 6 visits per year per person covered by MSP, proactive and preventative mental health care, a healthcare system that works. How many people have been exposed to these dangerous and toxic drugs because they haven't been able to seek medical help where they need it in their communities? They cannot get to a doctor because they are experiencing pain that they can't endure. Trauma plays an enormous role in what drives addictions and substance use. And we have to recognize that evidence has to inform decision making. The decision by the Premier yesterday, which feels like a long time ago, by the way, to say that he's going to go all in on what he calls assertive care. There isn't evidence that forced treatment of people with addictions work. I was on the health committee for the better part of a year. We listened to experts, we listened to doctors, we listened to scientists, we listened to people with lived experience, we listened to police, we listened to paramedics, we listened to frontline nurses, we listened to a lot of people. And the report that we produced was based on what we heard. And that report was starting place, a continuum of care that starts with prevention, proactive, and care for people when they need it. I keep hearing these stories from parents saying, I couldn't get care for my child when they needed it. My child was struggling with their mental health, and I couldn't find a psychiatrist or a counselor. I couldn't get care for my child. We have to fix that. If anybody's child needs help, that should be available in our communities. That should be part of the community health centers that we're proposing, that would include psychologists and social workers and counselors and nurses and nurse practitioners and doctors, so that we're not waiting until people are in an absolute emergency before that's the first time that they can access the public health care system in a mental health crisis. We have so much work to do to build the system that should be there right now. And yet we have politicians who are banking on people's fear and people's concerns, legitimate concerns about public safety, legitimate fears about what they're seeing in their communities. But they're banking on that being enough, that a 3 or 4 word answer to this crisis that has been decades in the making is going to somehow solve this, and it's not. We have to invest in the people, in their health and well-being. We have to invest in our children. We have to invest in our education system. That is the only way we get out of this crisis.
Alec, I'm going to go back to you there in Victoria. I know that you've got another question all lined up. Over to you.
For sure. Yes, my question to Sonia is bringing back down memory lane. Obviously, Andrew Weaver was the leader of the party before you took over. Just wondering what your thoughts are now on sort of where he was and past the NDP, and just what does this mean for a party if you have a former leader coming out like this and talking about, going against maybe what he believed in for so many years?
It's funny, I think of him never, but I'm asked about him by reporters a lot. Look, I am presenting to British Columbia a vision that the BC Greens have for this province. I'm presenting a platform that we've put an enormous amount of work and effort into. It is detailed, it will be costed, it is focused on what we need to do to solve problems from affordable housing to action on climate change to innovation to an economy that works for everybody. I pay no attention to what the former leader, whose friend he is today. It is of no interest to me because I'm focused on the job that I'm here to do, which is to show British Columbians that we can live and we can be the best place to live on earth. But in order for us to get there, we have to commit to evidence-based, data-informed, realistic, honest solutions to the problems that we face today. And when I see the growing rhetoric and hollowness of our political discourse, I am only more and more determined to say we can offer something other than that. We can show that there's another way of doing this. And so I don't know, Alec, if I'm answering your question, but honestly, I don't have time in my day. I work 14 or 16 hours a day. I don't have time in my day to think about whose friend he is today.
So you talked about addictions and the opioid crisis, but associated with that is mental health, because many people with mental health challenges unfortunately wind up on the street. They don't get the care that they require. On September the 4th, I was walking into work, and I deviated from my schedule just a little bit. Otherwise, I would have been in the direct line of fire of the fellow who unfortunately took one person's life and cut off somebody else's hand. It was incredibly unnerving to me because I went, okay, there's people who are facing challenges around drug consumption. Usually when you see them, they're in a state where they couldn't stand up, let alone chase you. This is completely different. And we have to find an answer to this.
Yeah, we really do. And this is deeply distressing, and it's terrifying. And when I reflect on this, I think, okay, this is a systems failure, right? This is a person that was known to the criminal justice system, that was known to have mental illness, and yet somehow the concurrent systems, and let's be clear, right now in BC, there are 20,000 people put into involuntary care per year. It's not that we don't have involuntary care. It very much exists. But to not want to answer the question of how is it that people are falling so deeply through the cracks of both our criminal justice system and our mental health system, that they are abandoned in these conditions that should not exist in Canada. And we are seeing these absolutely terrible and distressing and unacceptable outcomes. So when a child dies in the Ministry of Children and Families, there's an investigation. There's an inquiry to find out how that happened. I want inquiries. I want investigations. How is it that we are spending this much money on these systems and they are continually providing these kinds of failures and outcomes? We need to ask the question, how does this happen? Why is this continuing to happen? When we look at the fact that people with disabilities, whether physical or cognitive disabilities, are expected to find a way to survive without homes, without a place to live and sleep, is a failure of our systems. We have an $89 billion budget in this province this year. And if you can't solve the problems with an $89 billion budget, that itself is a failure. And in the case of this, one, we have to find out, why are these systems failing so badly? Two, we have examples of a successful model that's working in Duncan, the village site, where people are being housed, they're creating a sense of belonging community, there is services that come to people, they're getting into roads of employment, and they're moving forward with their lives. We should be replicating the models that are working, that have evidence and data to prove. We have an 18% decrease in criminal activity in the neighborhood where the village site is in Duncan. That's a proven model. We have data. It's been proven for the community, and it's been proven for the people who have been able to live there and get back to their lives and get on with their lives. That's the investment I want to see. When we can provide the basic necessities of life to people, get them the services and care that they need in those conditions, then we can start to identify who needs more help and where are our systems letting people fall through the cracks. But to use that as the basis for then to say we're going to take an approach that has no evidence to back up that it works. We're going to spend, let's just walk through this for a minute. So David Eby and John Rustad are both saying we're going to build this whole involuntary care system. Okay, who are the healthcare workers that are going to be in that system? Where is the money coming from to build that system? What are we going to not have if we're spending our resources on that? Because I would argue that if we built community healthcare centers and if we ensured that people had access to mental health supports earlier than they do now, that if we had people that had access, the million people who don't have a family doctor right now actually got access to primary longitudinal care. And we insisted that we do not leave people to live in the streets in our communities, and we spent the money on ensuring that everyone is housed, which is, by the way, less expensive than leaving people unhoused. We could see remarkable improvements in our communities in this province very quickly. That's what I want government to spend their energy and their resources on ensuring that we are meeting the basic needs of people in this province, that we are ensuring that everyone has a place to live, and that people have access to the basic services that they should expect as members of our communities.
So a couple of years ago, I very briefly heard and was happy to hear the acknowledgement out of Victoria of the missing middle. And then poof, any focus on that disappeared. I think of them actually as the disenfranchised middle. Sean, I want to go to a question that has come in from Slido that in some ways addresses this focus that has completely missed.
Thank you, Stuart. A question from Simon. This election seems to be all about the economy and street disorder. Not surprising given inflation and recent headlines. I haven't heard a lot from the Greens on the economy, but how do you plan to get BC back to prosperity?
So BC is both a place and it's the people that make this place what it is. And so for BC to be back in prosperity, we need people to be in a place where they are themselves thriving. If I can connect that to your comment about the missing middle and about housing, because I think this is also a really important piece, where when people are looking at an average one-bedroom apartment in Victoria is now $2,169. I want to ask the question of how many people can afford that? And what are the conditions that we're asking people to try to live in now in order for our economy, which depends on people, to be thriving? And so it's not just missing middle. We're 4 decades downstream from the end of investments into non-market housing in this country. The end of federal investments into co-op and social housing. When those investments dried up, it took a long time for those upstream investments to have the downstream, the lack of upstream investments to have the downstream impacts. But we're here now. We're in the downstream. And we have surrendered housing to a for-profit model. And in the last 20 years, we have allowed for a new type of housing model to basically come into this province and take root. And that is real estate investment trust, financialized housing. In Surrey, between 2001 and 2023, 59% of all rental units that were purchased by financialized landlords. What is their purpose? It's to deliver profits to their shareholders. So our housing in this province has become a commodity that delivers profits to shareholders from anywhere in the world. Anyone can invest in these real estate investment trusts in what amount to sort of hedge funds. And what they're promising is, hey, we can extract greater and greater returns on your investment by doing what they've been doing for the last 20 years, which is evict people. We have the highest rate of no-fault eviction in BC, and then turn around and push that rent up significantly. In Canada, in the last 2 years, we've had a 22% increase in rental costs across the country. Hands up if you've had a 22% increase in your wages or salaries in the last 2 years. So now housing has become so disconnected in its price from what people are able to earn. We've created these conditions where more and more people just cannot live here. We cannot have a thriving economy if people can't live in the communities where they work. We cannot have thriving business conditions if there aren't people here to work in those businesses. And so the role of government, again, that was a mistake 4 decades ago that the government made to stop investing in that buffer against an entirely profit-driven housing market. And when you look at places like Vienna, or you look at Paris, or you look at Singapore, where governments say, we take this very seriously, we're going to invest deeply in non-market and truly affordable housing, what that does is it puts a ceiling on the for-profit housing. And it says, yeah, you know, go for your investment and go for your profit, but we're actually going to have alternatives for people over here that are really affordable. And so people can choose between your $2,100 one-bedroom apartment or an affordable $1,100 one-bedroom apartment over here. And I see you're bringing your rents down because you actually want people to live in your apartment. So we have to have a really serious conversation about what has been allowed to happen in the last couple of decades when it comes to housing in this province. And as much as the story of, don't worry, we can just build enough supply to get ourselves out of this, the problem with that story is there is enough global capital and global wealth. Let me bring you back to the $14.2 trillion that the billionaires now collectively have, to always find a way to attract people to say, oh, here's a safety deposit box, otherwise known as a house or a condominium or an apartment, that you can put your money into. And so we need to have that decommodified housing so that we have people who are thriving and living in the communities and being part of building this extraordinary future that is possible, but now out of reach for far too many people.
So let's go to Alec for one last question here. I know that we're keeping you for a long time, and I really appreciate your dedication to answering all these questions fully. Thank you. Alec, one more question for you.
Yes, my last question for you, Sonia, is just talking about the state of political discourse. I know it's something that you've had concerns about over the past number of months, talking about the style of rhetoric that's very polarizing maybe in nature between your opponents. Just wondering, what are your thoughts, and are we seeing some filtration of maybe American-style cultural politics coming up into Canada?
Yeah, thanks, Alec. And yeah, I am very concerned about our political discourse. I'm very concerned about the rhetoric. I'm very concerned about that kind of arrival of the more American style kind of culture wars based politics that I think we've been very proud in Canada that we've not been a part of that we've been proud of our parliamentary system, our democratic system, that it has really not engaged in that, but we are definitely seeing more and more. One of the bulwarks against that is what I was talking about earlier, is ideally a legislature where people have to work together, where people have to sit down across the table and respectfully listen to each other and come up with solutions together. But another one is that to recognize that democracy is participatory for everybody, that democracy is only as healthy as the level of participation of the people that are part of that democracy. And we saw in 2020, the voter outcome was 50%. Half of people stayed home in 2020. Half of people didn't vote. And so when you have 50% of people vote, and right around 50% of the people that did vote voted NDP, and the NDP got 57 out of 87 seats. They didn't get half the seats. They got significantly more. But to do the math here, it's really important. 1 in 4 voters in British Columbia delivered a massive majority to one political party. And this is one of the problems with our electoral system, is that it disenfranchises a lot of people who feel, and I hear this a lot, my vote doesn't count, or it doesn't matter if I vote. It does matter if you vote. Just ask Jeremy Valeria at 60 votes. But it also encourages political parties to kind of encourage us to stay home. Because if you can get a majority government with only 25% of eligible voters voting for you, that's a pretty good return on investment for a political party. And so when the discourse becomes so alienating and so unrooted in what people would hope for and expect for from their elected representatives, what that does for a lot of people is it just makes them want to stay away. It makes them want to stay home. And so the way that we turn this around is actually more participation from the public and a commitment from political leaders to strengthen our democracy, not weaken it. And so it's not just turning out to vote. It's watching something like this. It's attending your local all candidates debates. It's looking at the platforms of the parties. It's really understanding what people stand for, not the high-level 3-word rhyming slogans, but dive deep into what political parties are offering. Dive deep into your representative. You go into the ballot box and you vote for the one person that you want to represent you. You're not typically voting for the person who's going to be premier. You're not voting for a party, you're voting for a representative. And if we collectively decide as a province that we're going to send the best representatives to the legislature, then we get the best return on our investment as voters. We get the best kind of representation. Elect serious people. Elect people who have demonstrated that they're committed to working in their communities. Elect people who have shown you that they're willing to listen not just to the people that agree with them, but to listen to others. Elect people who are focused on solutions. Elect people who bring people together. In the last 7 years in Cowichan, I've been part of the Cowichan Leadership Group. That's the MP and the MLA, the chair of the CVRD, the Cowichan Valley Regional District, the mayors of the region, the chief of Cowichan Tribes, the head of the RCMP, and our health officer. And monthly, we would meet and talk about the ways that we can work together to better serve our community and better serve people in Cowichan. And that has been phenomenally successful. Elect people that will work across party lines. Elect people that will work across jurisdictions. Elect people that will commit to the work in a way that brings the public in, that focuses on strengthening community, that focuses on the things that unite us, that focuses on the things that bring us together and remind us that we have way more in common than what divides us or separates us. And then we start getting the democracy that we deserve and the representation that we deserve.
Thank you. That's a wonderful note to wrap up this evening on, and I really appreciate you taking the time to answer in paragraphs, as you said, rather than sound bites. I think that it's important that all of us have an opportunity to meet each of the leaders, to be able to see how they think and how they respond and what their thoughts are about the issues that face us now and well into the future. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you all for joining us here in person and online. We'll be back tomorrow night with John Rustad, the leader of the Conservative Party of British Columbia. Good night.